My name is Ava Bennett, and for most of my adult life, I believed that family came first, no matter what. I was raised by my parents, Judith and Leonard, in a modest home in a quiet suburb. My younger brother, Miles, was always the golden child, showered with affection and leniency, while I was expected to be the responsible one. As I grew older, that expectation morphed into obligation. It wasn't something that was discussed, it simply was. I was the one who helped when bills came up short, who bought groceries when the fridge was empty, who paid Miles's tuition when he floundered through yet another college semester. Looking back, I can see how the lines began to blur between love and responsibility, between support and sacrifice. The narrative that guided my life was one where I believed my worth came from what I could provide. And for years, I played that role diligently. I gave and gave, often at the expense of my own comfort and well-being. I told myself it was temporary, that things would even out eventually. But eventually never came. This is the story of how I woke up to the reality of my situation, the exploitation that masqueraded as familial duty. It is about the moment I chose myself for the first time, and the messy, painful journey of setting boundaries with the people I once thought I could never say no to. It is a story about reclaiming power, about recognizing the quiet ways we allow ourselves to be used, and finding the strength to stop. For as long as I can remember, I was the backbone of my family. I took on that role without protest, internalizing the belief that it was simply what daughters did. After graduating college, I landed a good job in marketing, and immediately my salary became the household safety net. When my parents' car broke down, I paid for repairs. When Miles failed a class and needed to retake it during summer school, I footed the bill. I even covered the mortgage more times than I can count. No one asked outright. It was always implied, always expected. Judith, my mother, had a way of framing her requests as if they were mutually beneficial. "We're all in this together," she'd say, her voice tinged with guilt that I mistook for gratitude. Leonard, my father, was more direct. He'd hand me a bill and say, "It's just until we get back on our feet." But they never quite found their footing, and neither did I. Miles never held a job longer than a few months, always promising that his next venture would be different. But it never was. Despite the constant drain on my finances and energy, I kept giving. I rationalized it with thoughts like, "They need me," or "I can't let them fall apart." I didn't realize that while I was holding them up, no one was holding me. There were no thank yous, no offers to repay, no recognition of the toll this was taking on me emotionally and financially. Instead, there was entitlement. It became normal for my parents to ask for my paycheck before I'd even had a chance to decide what to do with it. My wants were secondary, my needs invisible. What hurt the most wasn't the money, it was the absence of acknowledgement. I was running on empty, emotionally and financially, and no one noticed, or if they did, they didn't care enough to say anything. I was their safety net, their plan B, and they had no backup plan if I ever chose to step away. I started to feel less like a daughter and more like an ATM. Still, I held on, believing that my loyalty would eventually be rewarded with respect, or at least appreciation. But that day never came. The more I gave, the more was expected. And slowly, resentment began to take root in my heart. I ignored it at first, but resentment has a way of growing in silence, of festering beneath the surface until it's too loud to ignore. This was the reality I lived in for years, until one moment shattered the illusion and forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. I was not a cherished family member. I was a resource, and I had allowed it. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from work, soaked from the downpour and exhausted from a day filled with back-to-back meetings. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension. Judith was waiting in the kitchen, her arms crossed, a sour expression on her face. Leonard sat at the table, silent but stern. Miles was nowhere to be seen. "We need to talk," Judith began, her tone already defensive. What followed was a blur of accusations, twisted logic and veiled resentment. They claimed I was making them feel like burdens, that my financial help came with too much attitude, that I was acting like I was better than them. Then, the final blow, Judith told me that it might be best if I moved out. I stood there, stunned. For years, I had sacrificed everything for them, my money, my peace, my sense of self, and now I was being pushed out like an unwelcome guest. Something shifted inside me at that moment. All the justifications I had made for their behaviour crumbled. I saw the situation with painful clarity. I had never truly been seen or valued for who I was. I was a tool, a convenience. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply walked to my room, packed a suitcase, and left. Not because they asked me to, but because I finally realised I deserved better. For the first time in years, I began to think about what I wanted. I started small, renting a modest apartment on my own, setting a strict budget, and, most importantly, refusing to send money back home. When the calls and texts started coming in, pleading, manipulating, guilt-tripping, I ignored them, or answered with a calm but firm, "I can't help you." It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most liberating. I was finally choosing myself. The silence from my family didn't last long. Within days, my phone lit up with messages, from Judith, from Leonard, and eventually from Miles. At first they were polite, concerned. They said they missed me, asked how I was doing, but when I didn't immediately respond with my usual offering of money or help, the tone shifted. Judith accused me of abandoning them. Leonard said I was being selfish. Miles, of all people, had the audacity to say I was tearing the family apart. It would have been funny if it didn't sting so much. The emotional manipulation was relentless. They brought up memories, holidays, sacrifices they had supposedly made for me. Every call, every message was laced with guilt. But something in me had changed. I could see through their tactics now. The guilt didn't settle in my chest the way it used to. I started writing down affirmations, reminders that I was not responsible for their poor choices, that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them. I repeated those truths to myself until they became louder than the voices on the phone. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, second-guessing everything, wondering if I was heartless, if I had become cold. But each morning, I woke up in a space that was mine, peaceful, quiet, and free of demands. I remembered why I made the choice. The biggest shock came a few weeks later when I learned from a mutual acquaintance that my parents were on the verge of losing the house. Despite the money I had sent for years, they had mismanaged it all, missed mortgage payments, spent beyond their means, lied to me about where the money was going. That revelation was both devastating and affirming. It proved what I had long suspected but didn't want to admit. They never saw me as a person with feelings and limits, just a lifeline they could use until I ran dry. When Judith called again, this time crying, saying they were going to be homeless, I felt a flicker of the old urge to help, but I held firm. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, "but I can't help you anymore." And I meant it. The revelation didn't come all at once. It was pieced together through offhand comments from old neighbours, inconsistencies in things Judith and Leonard said, and, finally, the hard truth that came from the mortgage company when a letter meant for them was accidentally forwarded to my new address. They were 6 months behind on payments. Foreclosure was no longer a threat. It was imminent. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter, my coffee growing cold. It wasn't just that they were in trouble. It was the realization that they had been lying to me. For years, I had wired money into their account, trusting them to use it for the mortgage, utilities, and essentials. But now, I knew better. That money had vanished into their poor decisions, extravagant purchases, help for Miles's endless stream of failed ventures, maybe even things I didn't want to imagine. I felt betrayed, not because they were struggling, but because they had taken advantage of me while pretending to be grateful. They had asked me to sacrifice, all while hiding the truth. It wasn't just financial exploitation, it was emotional fraud. What struck me most was how they had built a facade for years. They played the part of the struggling family, always just a little short, always needing just a bit more to stay afloat. And I had bought into it again and again because I wanted to believe they needed me. I wanted to believe my help mattered. But it hadn't saved anything. Not the house, not Miles's future, not their pride. When I confronted Judith on the phone, she didn't deny it. She just sobbed and said they didn't want to worry me, that they thought things would turn around. I listened, but I didn't offer solutions. I didn't reach for my checkbook. I just said, "I wish you had told me the truth sooner." That was the moment I fully let go, not out of anger, but clarity. I realized I'd spent years trying to rescue people who weren't willing to save themselves. I had handed them lifelines, but they never learned to swim. So I stepped away. I started therapy. I focused on building a life that was mine, one rooted in honesty, peace, and boundaries. The revelation didn't just open my eyes. It gave me the permission I didn't know I needed to stop. In the months that followed, I learned to sit with silence, to embrace it even. For the first time in my adult life, there were no emergency phone calls, no panicked requests, no subtle manipulations, just me, my space, my choices. I reconnected with old friends, took up journaling, and started spending weekends doing things I genuinely enjoyed, things I'd always put off because someone else needed me more. I travelled, I read, I healed. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me unlearn the patterns that had defined my sense of self for so long. I began to understand that love, real love, doesn't demand self-sacrifice. It doesn't thrive on guilt or obligation. Love respects boundaries. It listens. It gives back. My family didn't change. The calls grew less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. I grieved that loss, not because I wanted them back the way they were, but because I had once believed so deeply in the illusion of what we were. But in that space, something new grew. Self-respect. I stopped defining myself by what I could give others and started asking what I wanted for myself. I stopped apologizing for having limits. I stopped bending until I broke. Ava Bennett is no longer the daughter who funds, fixes, and fills every gap. She's just Ava now, a woman who learned the hard way that the most profound act of love can sometimes be saying, "No more." This journey wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about reclaiming myself. And in doing so, I found a version of peace I never thought possible. A peace rooted in truth, in autonomy, and in the unwavering belief that I am enough. Not because of what I give, but simply because I am.